and certainly in poetry as well. Of course, Emily Dickinson's important, but Walt Whitman has a very different style and some very different things to say. So we'll talk about him today. Let's see, next week coming up is, Mark Twain. That will be really fun. And the Diary of Adam and Eve, that's next Tuesday. And then I think Jack London is coming up after that. So lots of exciting things over the next few weeks. Excuse me. I first read Walt Whitman when I think I was in college. I was about your age. And I was assigned The Leaves of Grass, much as you were. And I read the first few pages and I thought, I have no idea what this guy is talking about or what he's going for even in this book. We'll look at more detail at Leaves of Grass in just a few minutes, but it's not easy. So don't be disturbed or worried if you didn't get it, if you really weren't sure what was going on, because most people don't the first time, and people spend their entire lives studying the Leaves of Grass and trying to figure it out and still don't really have a good grasp on it. So what I was really looking for, is for you to get an impression more than anything else, an impression of how Walt Whitman writes, an impression of how the Leaves of Grass works, how it sounds in your ear, what he's going for. Hopefully you saw a few common themes going on there, some certain ideas that we will talk about and we'll look at when we look at the text itself. I just put this up here just to show you, if you ever think that writing, that writing just springs out of somebody's head like Athena did out of the head of Zeus, it's not true. Most authors work very hard on what they do, and they revise it again and again, and certainly Walt Whitman did so with his poems. And if you ever get a chance, if you're in London, go to the British Library, and this very nondescript looking room sort of in the back over to the left has some of the greatest works of English literature in it. And what they have is several collections of manuscripts, and you can see how the writer is developing, crossing out here and there and putting in new words and all of this. So it's a process. They have a little piece of paper with Paul McCartney's Yesterday, the song Yesterday. I'm not going to sing for you, but it's a very famous song, one of the most famous songs of the 20th century. And you can see him doodling here and there, crossing out, replacing words. And so it's a process. So that's one thing I definitely want you to think about with Walt Whitman, because with The Leaves of Grass, it took 40 years for him to write this book. I don't mean it took 40 years to publish it, but he publishes it, I think, for the first time in 1855. And then he doesn't stop until 1892 or something like that. He keeps revising it again and again, and it grows and changes along the way. So it's very much an organic sort of text that changes over time. Well, where's he from? That's always a good question to ask. Brooklyn, New York. And so he's raised there in Brooklyn, and he's raised in a few different neighborhoods. Walt Whitman, unlike some of the people we've studied so far this semester, came from a rather poor family, kind of like Charles Dickens, actually. It wasn't like dirt poor, starving to death poor, but it was pretty poor. And so his father, like a lot of the fathers we've seen so far, moved around a lot, had a lot of different jobs, ran out of luck on some, money-making schemes here and there. And so the poor mom, as usual, is the one who has to hold it all together. And so she raised the children, and his father was a fine man. That's not it. It's just the moms who are the untold heroes of so many of these stories, so many of these life stories. Was the one who held it all together and took care of the family. And Walt, he got some schooling, actually, until the age of 12. And then he had to drop out. He had to drop out so he could work and make money for his family, which sounds so strange to us, but I think back on my own grandparents who were born before World War I, just before World War I, and they came of age. They were in their teens during the Depression, and none of them, well, one of them finished high school. The others had to drop out about 6th, 7th, or 8th grade just to go to work and just to make some money to help support the family. So that was a very common story. Unlike Thoreau, who was able to go into college, Walt Whitman couldn't. So he had to go to work. And a common theme again with almost all of the people that we have studied this semester, he was very well self-taught. He loved reading. And so from the very beginning, he would read everything he could get his hands on and learned a lot. Poetry, history, Shakespeare. He loved Shakespeare. He would just read anything he could get. And so he got a pretty good education without going past, whatever he would be at 12th grade. What's that, 7? Anyway, 12 years old. So he didn't get past that. But he taught himself very well. And what he did when he went to work, rather than like Charles Dickens, who had to work making, slapping labels on shoe polish for 12, 13 hours a day, Walt Whitman worked very hard in a difficult industry, but it was really a very interesting one. He became a typesetter, and he worked in a printing office, and he learned the skills of typesetting, which is something that's just vanished. Nowadays, naturally enough, we have computers. And so if you want to print something, all you got to do is, boom, enter it into your MacBook and print it out, and there it goes. But back in these days, what they had to do was they had to use these machines. And I'm young enough old enough, excuse me, to be, to remember this. When I was a Cub Scout, when I was, 8 or 9 years old, I was a Cub Scout. We went to the newspaper office in the local town, and we got a tour. And what they had was these machines that looked actually very much like that. This is in the very late 60s, early 70s. They had these machines, and what they would do is they had hot lead that would form these different type pieces. And they put all these together, and then that's how they would print a newspaper or whatever they wanted to print. It was a real process. And this is what Walt learns. He learns all the ins and outs of the printing business. And so this is a really valuable skill for him to have later on, because he's going to publish some of his own books. The very first edition of Leaves of Grass, he paid for himself, and he published himself and sent it out. So it was really, if you have to have some sort of manual skill as a poet, this is a really good one to have. And this is what Walt Whitman learned when he was a teenager. And then he used these skills and became really a journalist, if you want to put a label on it. That's what he did. So in his 20s, he worked. He worked for different places, different publications, magazines, newspapers. He wrote, he did some writing. He wrote serials. Remember, we talked about Dickens, published the Pickwick Papers in serials. That is, like every week there'd be a new chapter. That was really big back then, and Walt Whitman did that too, and published in magazines. He got a little bit of notice, not a whole lot, but he made a little bit of money. And then he wrote articles for newspapers. He was a reporter. He did again a fantastic way for a writer to learn their craft. When you write something. If you ever write something, you can get it published. It's really a, I've done it before, where, I will work my tail off on, say, a chapter about, who knows what, Alexander the Great or something or other. And, I'm done with it, and I just think it's the greatest thing ever written in the history of Western civilization. And so I send it off to the editor, and he or she sends it back, marked up, torn apart, saying, forget this, lose this, change this, and you just want to sit down and cry when you get this back, because it's like, your child is being criticized. But it is one of the best teachers ever. It teaches you how to write better. And so this is what Whitman went through. His editors just tore apart what he wrote, and so he learned better how to write, how to put words down on paper. And so really, really good skill. It's fascinating to see, if you look in the 1800s, 1900s, even 20th century, some of the very best authors started off as journalists, started off as reporters, and they went through this whole process, being torn apart by editors, and it made them really good. Well, what was going on at the time? We've seen some variation of this slide, certainly more than once. Slavery was going on in the American South, and it was tearing America apart. Walt Whitman was very much anti-slavery, wrote against it, not nearly as, proactive as Henry David Thoreau was about getting thrown in jail and such, but definitely against, slavery, against for the same reasons as Thoreau, just because it's just wrong, but also what it does to everybody involved, what it did to the whole country. So that's a big feature in his life. It's a big feature in everybody's life in the mid-1800s, and it's very hard to avoid it unless you're Emily Dickinson and you're basically hiding in your room. For everybody else, it was like the thing that was talked about and written about all the time, the great injustice of slavery. And the Civil War. Leaves of Grass is published actually in 1855. The Civil War starts in 1861, I believe, so Leaves of Grass comes out just a few years before the Civil War. But the Civil War is a very central feature. Whitman lives into the 1890s, so in the middle of his life, the later part of his younger years, in his middle age, the Civil War just loomed over everything, the Civil War being the culmination, really, of the great slavery debate. He had brothers who served in the Civil War. It was the sort of thing that just tore people apart, tore families apart. You hear the cliche about brothers fighting each other in the Civil War. They really did. In the Civil War, you got to remember, think about the mechanics of it. You had weapons which had, in the previous, say, 30, 40 years, developed exponentially in their power. People, these Civil War guns that soldiers of both sides carried around were basically cannons, little cannons that could just blast a hole in somebody at 100 yards. And the bayonets too, as well, just caused horrible wounds. But the generals, the colonels, were still fighting the Civil War as if it was 1776. They were lining up people and marching slowly into the face of the enemy, and people were just getting mowed down. It was horrible. The wounds, the death, and the wounds were just unbelievable. You can imagine more people died of wounds and infected wounds than died straight out in the Civil War. Anyway, that's going to be a big influence on Walt Whitman and on his shaping his opinion. And what happens is his brother goes missing. His brother's a soldier. And so Walt goes down to D.C., Washington, D.C., to try to find him. He heard he might be there in a hospital. He turns out to be okay. But while Walt is there, he goes into a hospital which was not nearly as neat and pretty as this. The hospitals were really gruesome, horrible things. They tried their best, but there was no anesthesia. They were experimenting with a few things like ether, but it was horrible. So if you walked into a hospital in the Civil War era, even a good one, what would have struck you were the screams and the cries and the smell of rotting flesh. And this struck Walt Whitman. And so what he did, instead of running away, though, was volunteer. And he said, I want to help. What can I do? And so Walt becomes a nurse, an aide, an orderly, and takes care of wounded soldiers in the Union hospitals during the Civil War. War made a huge impression on him, just like it's going to make a huge impression on Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. World War I was the formative event in their lives. And the Civil War, I think, was the formative event for Walt Whitman as well. Another thing that Walt Whitman believed in that was a little bit different than Thoreau was what you probably studied back in middle school or high school, the manifest destiny. The idea that America had a manifest destiny, a clear destiny to take over all of North America and to head west and to colonize. And this is a very famous illustration, which I think actually lays it out very nicely. I don't know if the illustrator meant to show things quite as clearly and bleakly as this, but you can see this is Lady Liberty, America, whatever, flying west with a telegraph line trailing behind her. And then you see the trains going, you see the stagecoaches, you see the settlers, the miners, everybody is heading west. The Native Americans, of course, are not enjoying this experience at all. They are having their lands taken away from them. The buffalo are being killed. Poor, I think, grizzly bear down here is not having a very good time either. But Walt Whitman believed in this, like most people did at that time. Most Americans did. They really, even if they didn't say it, they believed that this is our destiny to go out and to conquer this continent. And so Americans did. And there was a lot of problems along the way. Certainly the Mexican-American War is a result of this idea that America needs to spread, the United States needs to spread all the way to the Pacific, all the way to here in California. But Walt believed in this, which was a little bit different, as I said, from Thoreau, who was much more of a leave people alone sort of idea. Walt Whitman really believed in America. He was much more of a nationalist than a lot of the people at the time. So that comes out in his writings and in his work. This is, he lived in, died actually here in Camden, New Jersey, which is just across the river from Philadelphia. It's actually a nice little house, nice little neighborhood. He lived for a long time, as I said, into the 1890s, working all the time, writing up until the very end when he dies, in one evening, I think it was, here in this house, which you can visit. This is his obituary, Death of Walt Whitman, peaceful end of the old grand poet at Camden, Philadelphia, March 26th, I think that says. So he's lived a long life. He was known, not anything like Dickens, and certainly a whole lot more than Emily Dickinson was. If you take those two as extremes, sort of here's Charles Dickens, who's known by like everybody in the world, and Emily Dickinson, who's known by practically nobody. Walt Whitman somewhere in the middle. He was known, he was a good writer, a respected writer, but he really didn't come into his own until after his death, fairly long after his death, really in the 20th century is when people really began to appreciate Walt Whitman the most. What did he believe? What were his religious beliefs, his philosophical beliefs? Well, very much like Thoreau. I had that chart about transcendentalism up, about belief in the individual, the power of the individual, the ability of the individual to relate to the universe / God without any churches or scripture or anything like that. So he was a deist. If you ask Walt Whitman, do you believe in God? He would have said, yes, of course they do. Just like Thoreau would have said the same thing. But if you pinned him down for what exactly he meant by that, he would probably get a little bit vague about what his belief in God was. People have called him a deist, a transcendentalist, a pantheist. I think probably all of those labels are at least somewhat accurate. He certainly was not what you would consider a standard Christian. Like Charles Dickens was. It was he had his faults and his sins, but he throughout his whole life he worked very hard and fell very much into the Orthodox traditions of the Church of England. But Walt Whitman wasn't at all like that. He was doing his own thing, most certainly. And as I said before, it's so hard to try to define transcendentalism and deism because you get so many different varieties of it. It's just wildly varied. But when I think of Walt Whitman, I think of this. I think of something like this, a picture like this. I think that if you want to read the Leaves of Grass, what you really need to do is climb up the hill to the cross Put the cross to your back, because Walt wouldn't have liked that cross up there. But look out of the oceans and the hills and all, and start saying, "I sing the body electric," or whatever verse you want to read from his poetry. It's enthusiastic. That's one thing about Walt Whitman's poetry. If you look at it, it's different, very different from Emily Dickinson's, in that it's very much enthusiastic. We'll look at this in just a minute. But I would think of Walt doing something like this, kind of like Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music. The hills are alive. I think of Walt starting that. If you ever wanted to do a musical version of his work, you'd have to do it very much like The Sound of Music, I think. Anyway, that's just a personal prejudice. Now, people have written a lot. I mean, people do. Some professors spend nothing but they do their whole lives talking about nothing but Walt Whitman's sexuality, about how did he really fit in, and where did he belong? Was he gay? Was he bisexual? Was he heterosexual? What was going on? And it's so hard to know. I mean, Walt Whitman lived at a time where, Thoreau, you remember Thoreau, who really showed no interest in any sort of romance or sexuality or anything. Walt certainly seems to, but at that time in the mid-1800s, late 1800s, you didn't advertise it at all, because if you did, you could get in real trouble. Like Oscar Wilde here, who's on the left, he was one of the few people of the age who was out of the closet, and he ends up in jail in some real trouble. And he's a correspondent of Walt Whitman. They're pen pals with each other, and so and he actually came over and visited Walt Whitman in America at some point in his life, and he says, I left with the kiss of Walt Whitman on my lips." I don't know what that means, but anyway, Walt Whitman. Most people, if you really had to pin down scholars, they would say, yeah, he was gay. He may have experimented a little bit, with women here and there, but he really seems to have been. I mean, it doesn't, I don't think, affects his poetry terribly, certainly like Sappho. I mean, her poetry absolutely transcends, and so does Walt Whitman's. But people spend a lot of time worrying about this, and so I think that's probably the label. He was never married, unusual, but not that unusual in that time. And somebody asked him once, they came out and they were reading Leaves of Grass, and they said, "Mr. Whitman, is this about Greek love?" That was the phrase that was used for gay love. And he pretended to be shocked, and she said, "Oh no, I would never do such a thing. I spend my nights carousing in bars. I've fathered many illegitimate children with different women," and he's really trying, I think, to make a point with that, with saying, would it really matter if I am? Would you really prefer if I were just, some louse who went around and got lots of women pregnant? But anyway, I think that's probably where he falls, and it certainly comes out in his poetry. I think we'll look at that. He got in real trouble or real criticized because of the sexuality, not necessarily homosexuality, but sexuality that is in the Leaves of Grass. But he had a huge influence on everybody. I mean, pretty much everybody we're going to read did. Otherwise, why would we be reading them? People like Bram Stoker was a big fan of Walt Whitman. He wrote Dracula, which you may think is nothing like Whitman's poetry. It's not. But they were both authors, and so they wrote a lot of letters to each other. Ezra Pound, he comes along later, a really great American poet who spent the latter part of his life in Venice. In his, if you wanted to go, if you were a fan of Ezra Pound, and I don't know, I think this was in the 1950s or so, and you made your way to Venice hoping to meet him, the lady at the front door would make you quote some Ezra Pound poetry to prove that you were a fan, and then she might let you in, or she might not. But Ezra Pound was tremendously influenced by Walt Whitman. The beat poets Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, 1960s. When you think of Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, when you think of the electric Kool-Aid acid test, all of the books and movements that were going on in the 60s, peace, love, protest against Vietnam, all of some really great writers came out of it, but they were very much influenced by Walt Whitman. He really took off in the 60s. People really began to appreciate him much more than in the past. If you have great grandparents still around, you can ask them maybe about that. But Walt Whitman influenced a lot of people more in this, and still does. If you ask poets nowadays, if you ask writers, if you ask songwriters, Walt Whitman's poetry is turned into song more than anybody else's, I think, in American history. It sounds like music, and it's got so many variations. You can Google it sometime, Walt Whitman's poems put to music, and see how it shows up. A lot of it has, and one reason I think that is, just one, is that Walt Whitman loved the opera. He absolutely loved opera. He loved the emotion, the soaring emotions of opera. And I think that really comes out if you read Leaves of Grass, thinking about that, thinking about opera, it kind of almost makes more sense that he would write it this way. And so he has a very musical influence, a very musical style in many ways, even though he writes in what they call free verse, which is not, it doesn't follow any set poetic meter at all, but it still has a musical prose, musical quality to it. Well, Leaves of Grass, if you've read it, if any of you want to become a scholar, an English professor here at Pepperdine, and if you want to get a PhD and you want to study American literature, Walt Whitman, great option for you to write your dissertation on. But beware, if you write your dissertation on Leaves of Grass, the first thing your dissertation committee is going to drill you on is they're going to say, which edition? Because Leaves of Grass was a process. It starts off in 1855 and goes on until, 1892, almost 40 years. And Walt is always working on different editions. He's always reviving, cutting, adding, publishing. Sure, a lot of it stays the same, but a lot of it doesn't. And when you deal with scholars, they generally tend to like the earlier ones more than the latter ones. But it's still basically the same material, but it's changed and edited again and again. This happens a lot in literature. If you read, for example, the plays of Sophocles. You remember Oedipus Rex from Hume 111, if you read any of that. Oedipus Rex, Sophocles, he wrote that, it was published, it was performed, and then he wrote it again and again. And so he has these multiple revisions, which just drives classical scholars nuts because just trying to keep up with it. So it was a very common thing to revise works throughout the life of an author. And Walt Whitman is absolutely the best example I can think of this. All right, Leaves of Grass. Again, when I think about it, it's very visual to me, at least. Maybe it was to you, too. I think of something like this young woman here sort of seems to be either committing suicide or leaping up into the air. I'm not really sure which, but I think probably leaping up into the air with the birds and the sunshine and the hills and all. It is a poem of exaltation. If you read some of the Psalms, the Psalms, there's 150 of them in the Bible. They're all over the place in mourning and sadness and joy and anger. But there's some that are exaltation. And I think Leaves of Grass is very much like that. But let's just look. This is just the first page. But I think if you just look at the first page, it can tell you a lot about the whole book. I celebrate myself in what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. So Walt Whitman is very much about individualism, about the ability of each of us to relate to the divine universe. But he's also about the connection. Connections between people is so important to him. He says, what I feel, you feel. and we'll look at another example of how he does this, but it's one of the common themes of connectedness and unity and community in poetry. I'm not here on my own. We're all in this together, really, is, I guess you could say, is one way you could put it. But this poem, I'm sure, as you read it, as you're reading this first page, you notice how it jumps around. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. Where did that come from? Observing grass? I thought we were talking about celebrating ourselves, but now he's lying down on the grass. Then what's next? Houses and rooms are full of perfumes. The shelves are crowded with perfumes. I breathe the fragrance myself. I know it and like it. The distillation would intoxicate me also, but I shall not let it. So now we're inside, smelling perfume? I don't know. But he's very deliberately doing this. And again, people have spent their lives trying to understand this work. But he's jumping around in such a remarkable way. The atmosphere is not perfume. It has no taste of the distillation. It is odorless. It is for my mouth forever. I am in love with it. This passion, love, this is a feature of Walt Whitman's poetry. He is probably the most passionate poet I know. Passionate about life, passionate about grass and perfume and everything else. I will go to the bank by the wood and become undisguised and naked. I am mad for it to be in contact with me. Naked comes up a lot in Walt Whitman's poetry. He's always talking about naked people doing this and that. In fact, it's really funny. One of the first things that Walt Whitman wrote in his life before Leaves of Grass was this little manual about how to be a man. And it's great. It's fun to read. It's just wacky is probably the best description of it. But he talks about things like eat only meat. So it's kind of like a paleo diet back in the 1840s that he's pushing. If you want to increase your manly fortitude, eat only meat. Also, go nude sunbathing as much as possible. That's a little hard if you live in Philadelphia, but okay. But it's funny. But he really is into nakedness, and I think certainly in a sensual way, but also in a sense of just stripping away the conventions and throwing yourself out there open to the universe. The smoke of my own breath echoes, ripples, and buzzes whisper. Love cools, silk thread, crotch and vine, my respiration and lung, the beating of my heart, the passing of blood and air through my lungs. So he's very interested in the body. There's a whole branch of literature study about the study of the body in literature all over the world, and Walt Whitman is a great example of that. It's the physicality of his poetry, where he talks about the details of how our bodies work. Let's see, the sound of the belched words of my voice, words loose to the eddies of the wind. A few light kisses, ... A few embraces, ... A reaching around of arms, the play of shine and shade on the trees as the supple boughs wag. So we get a little bit of sex creeping in. There, arms embracing, reaching around and all, then it just sort of pulls back, and we're back in trees and all after that. But sensuality, in the truest sense of the word, sensuality is all over this poem, Leaves of Grass. In the sense of romance, yes, sex, yes, but more than that, just in the sense of embracing life itself and the generative process. So he doesn't hold back at all with sensuality. And this got him in trouble. When this book was published, the first one in 1855, the first reviewers said, first of all, this guy is totally obsessed with himself. And secondly, he's totally obsessed with sex in a most improper way. And so he got caught or called out on that, but he said, nope, that's the way I'm going to write. So just that first page of Leaves of Grass, I think, gives us a nice touch. And like I said, what I really hoped you would get out of Leaves of Grass reading it are impressions, feelings, not about memorizing all of it or anything like that, although you're most welcome to it, but just a taste for what Whitman writes and how he writes. And then there's so many great quotations, just like for Thoreau, but in Walt Whitman, I sing the body electric. The armies of those I love engirth me, and I engirth them. That connectedness again with families and friends. I think engirth, put your arms around, yeah, in a physical sense, yes, but in a spiritual, emotional sense also. They will not let me off till I go with them, respond to them, and discorrupt them, and charge them full with the charge of the soul. When Walt Whitman first wrote this, I Sing the Body Electric, electricity was barely invented at this point. So I think he's probably one of the first people to use electric as an adjective. But he does it in a way that I think struck people, but yet made them think about it too. When you think about electricity, I mean, don't think about the lights. Think about, I'm sure you did this when you were young, maybe you've done it since then. You accidentally shock yourself, like you do something wrong when you're plugging into, well, try this sometime, put a screwdriver into the, no, don't do that, please. You'll really hurt yourself. But if you've ever done that, like I think most of us have, think of that feeling that you had. Yeah, it hurts. It numbs you. It's shocking, but boy, you are alive for a few seconds when it does. And that's what Whitman is talking about. I sing the body electric. I sing the body alive. So it's a great passage, very typical of Whitman. His just all the great qualities he has. But he does other things too in Leaves of Grass, in his other poetry. Talking about connectedness. There's this great poem called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And what it is about is Whitman is catching a ferry across to Manhattan, which is a very normal thing to do. There weren't a lot of bridges back then, so everybody's riding the ferry back and forth. And he has an experience. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, if you've ever been on a commuter ferry, or if you've ever, I don't know, he sees into the future. This is a poem about connectedness to the people not around him, although it has that, but people in the future. Flood tide below me, I see you face to face. Clouds of the west, sun there half an hour high, I see you also face to face. Crowds of men and women attired in the usual costumes, how curious you are to me. So that's connectedness to the people around him. On the ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds that cross, returning home, are more curious to me than you suppose. And because everybody matters in Whitman's world. Everybody is special. Everybody is an incarnate soul of the universe. So everybody matters. And he's writing to you guys out there in the auditorium, and you that shall cross from shore to shore, years hence, are more to me and more in my meditations than you might suppose. This is an unusual thing that he does here. He's looking to the future, and his audience is not the people around him, just the people around him, but it's you. And he's writing to the people who will cross that ferry in 100 years, 150 years, and he says, I'm connected to you as well, and you are connected to me. I don't have a good example of anybody else who does this. And so that's one reason this poem is so famous, is that Walt is reaching across time in order to say that we are connected. And when you read this poem, when you cross that ferry, you are connected to me too. Well, Civil War happened, of course. He serves, and at the end of the Civil War, Lincoln is shot, assassinated. And Whitman was a huge Lincoln fan. He really thought he was just an amazing guy. And he wrote several poems, actually. Elegies is what you call them, writing an elegy for somebody. It's a poem about the dead, honoring them. So he wrote elegies. He gave lectures about Lincoln. Remember the nationalism that I talked about how important to America. Lincoln embodied that for Whitman. He was the greatest man of the age. And then when he's shot, it just shatters Lincoln. It shatters Whitman. And he is torn, and he responds in the only way he can. And one way he responds is to write this poem. And I put the Dead Poets Society up there. I don't know if you've ever seen this movie or not. It's really good, with Robin Williams, because the poem features in there. Robin Williams plays a teacher at a very prep and proper boys' school And he comes in there reading Walt Whitman and other things and sort of stages a revolution almost and gets in real trouble about it. I think Walt Whitman would have loved that movie. But he teaches them Walt Whitman. And so one poem in the movie is this, and you can see again how some editing has been done. "Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But, oh, heart, 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 where on the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead." It's borrowing a metaphor that goes all the way back to Homer and Virgil about the ship of state. And the leader of the state, whether it be Julius Caesar, whoever, is the governor, the captain at the helm. And he says, the captain of our ship is gone. We are adrift at this point. So this poem actually it came out, it was published in newspapers, people loved it. Because if you look at it, compare it to Leaves of Grass. Leaves of Grass, which has such a wild sort of structure to it. This one has a very conventional sort of structure. It's an amazing poem, really good. But people read this, little old ladies sitting in Amherst, Massachusetts, or whatever, read this and they said, "Oh my goodness, this is wonderful," because he follows the rules of poetry, and he has the stanzas. It's not in free verse, and it has beautiful imagery, and it draws on those old metaphors of ship or state. So it was a very popular poem for Whitman, and it should be. It's funny when you read Whitman critics nowadays, modern critics, they love Leaves of Grass generally. They don't like this poem because it's so conventional. But, Whitman is trying to say something that people hear. And so he writes this poem for Lincoln. And I think it's a pretty good example of the range, and it shows that Whitman certainly was capable of writing conventional poetry if he wanted to. That wasn't why he wrote free verse. But it's just one of many, many poems that Whitman wrote. He was such an influential guy and such somebody who you will now, if you hadn't heard of him before, you will now hear about him the rest of your life. And Whitman, Leaves of Grass especially, is one of the books that I'm hoping you'll take with you in your heart at least, because as I said at the first class, the point of this class, Humanities 313, is, to me at least, is to introduce you. This is probably the last humanities, the last literature class that you'll ever take in your life. So you'll go out into the world, you'll become fantastic accountants and lawyers and doctors and whatever you do, but I want you to take this class with you, take these works with you and come back to them. Like Leaves of Grass will mean something different to you in 10 years than it does now, and when you're my age, it will mean something different yet. So that's the whole point of the class, that's the whole point of Leaves of Grass. Leaves of Grass is a great example of a book to buy. Ask for it for Christmas sometime, and keep it up on your shelf and pull it out every few years, and I think it will certainly benefit you. That's actually it for today. Next time, Mark Twain, the